Aloha! Thank you for joining us here at truthmadeeasy.com as we continue with our Apologetics Made Easy video training course. The title for this video is The New Testament, Scribes and Manuscripts, as we continue through our 5 points here in our 5-point hand illustration. Point 1, of course, is God exists. 2, miracles are possible. 3, the New Testament is a good history book. 4, Jesus is God. And lastly, the Bible is the Word of God. We have already completed the first 2 points, God exists and miracles, and begin point 3 here on the New Testament in this video. In our studies of the New Testament, we will discover just how good of a history book the New Testament really is, and how it has accurately recorded historical events just as they happened 2,000 or so years ago. Here we have some images of famous historical figures that we read about in history books. At the top is former President John F. Kennedy, who, as you know, was assassinated about 50 years ago in 1963. Going back further, we have one of America's founding fathers, George Washington, the first president of the United States. Then, of course, the most famous of all historical figures, Jesus Christ, who was put to death by crucifixion back around 33 A.D. And going way back to 323 B.C., Alexander the Great. As we study the history books and study about the lives of these men, we can learn much about the people and events of their times. What's interesting about ancient history is that many of the original documents written by historians are no longer in existence. All we have today are copies of the originals. One such famous ancient work is the historical work known as Homer's Iliad. Some have dated the original writing to be between 760 and 710 BC. Only copies of the Iliad remain today. The original has not been found. Here we have a copy of a portion of a manuscript that's still around today, dating back to the 11th century. Now let's look at another ancient work, the New Testament, and one of its authors, the Apostle John, who wrote, among other things, the Gospel of John. Now, when John wrote the Gospel of John, there was just one copy, the original. To get the gospel to the believers in the many churches spread out over a large geographical area, copies had to be made. Unlike today, copies couldn't just be put on a printer or a copy machine. Each copy had to be made by hand. That's where the scribes came in. Here's a photo of a scribe from back in 1930 or so. That kind of helps us get an idea of what the scribe did back in ancient times. These scribes would carefully and meticulously make copies of documents. Now, back to the Gospel of John. Here we have what we could call the Apostle of John's original writing. Keep in mind that this is just an illustration, this is not a real document. Now, from the original, the scribes made copies, and then copies were made from those copies and distributed to the different churches. These copies are known as manuscripts. Now, we need to keep in mind that the Gospel of John is just one book of the New Testament. There are other books written by other authors. In total, there are 27 individual documents that make up the New Testament. Now, when you place that New Testament in your pocket or purse, you are carrying around with you a mini 27-book library. Now, like Homer's Iliad, we don't have the original documents written by the New Testament authors. We only have copies. So how do we know if the copies used for the New Testament were good, accurate copies of the original? And even if they were good copies, were the original documents truthful? After all, we could have good copies of a lie, right? Good copies of a myth. Well, in the next 2 videos, we will answer these 2 questions. Number 1, do we have an accurate copy of the original documents? And 2, do the original documents tell the truth? Well, I can tell you now ahead of time that from our studies, we will discover that we indeed have excellent copies, and the original documents are both truthful and reliable. As we're going to discover together, the New Testament is not just a good history book, it's an excellent history book, the most accurate and historically reliable book from the ancient world. We can believe what the New Testament tells us. Well, if you're ready to get started, join us for our next video as we talk about the New Testament, accurate copies of the original documents.